IJN I-169, the World War II sub that died in the dark. The conning tower rises from the sand at 110 feet, coral fingers spreading across steel that hasn't seen sunlight in 80 years. Torpedo tubes empty, hatches sealed from the inside, and in the flooded compartments, 70 men who never made it out. This isn't a wreck from Operation Hailstone, the devastating air raid that turned Truk Lagoon into a graveyard in February 1944. This is something quieter, something that happened 7 weeks later, when the war had moved on and no one was watching anymore. April 4th, 1944. A routine air raid alert, a submarine executing a standard crash dive to avoid detection, and then nothing. The boat never surfaced, the engines never restarted, and 70 men suffocated in the dark, not from bombs or torpedoes, but from something as mundane as a ventilation failure. No heroic battle, no dramatic last stand, just a mechanical failure, carbon dioxide buildup, and the slow realization that they weren't getting out. The Americans called Truk the Gibraltar of the Pacific, Japan's secret weapon, a fortress anchorage hidden behind a coral reef barrier in the Caroline Islands, about 800 miles northeast of New Guinea, a natural harbor large enough to hide an entire fleet. And for 2 years, it did exactly that. Cruisers, destroyers, cargo ships, tankers, submarines, everything the Imperial Japanese Navy needed to project power across the South Pacific, all concentrated in one seemingly invulnerable lagoon, until February 17-18, 1944, when American carrier planes turned the harbor into a killing field during Operation Hailstone. Over 50 ships sent to the bottom in 2 days. But I-169 wasn't there when it happened. It arrived later, after the carnage, to a base that was broken, depleted, barely functional. A KD-6A class submarine, commissioned in 1933, 11 years into a service life that should have ended quietly in some forgotten naval yard. Instead, it ended here, in 120 feet of crystal-clear tropical water. Not from enemy action, but from the kind of accident that kills quietly, without witnesses, without glory. Sitting at 100 to 130 feet in warm crystalline water, the wreck rests on an even keel on the lagoon floor, its hull largely intact. The location, Truk Lagoon's northern anchorage, the same waters that had seen the carnage of Hailstone 7 weeks earlier, when recreational divers first started exploring Truk's wrecks in the late 1960s. I-169 wasn't a priority. The lagoon held bigger, more dramatic targets from Hailstone, ships with visible battle damage, aircraft carriers, cruisers with their gun turrets still intact. Submarines were interesting, sure, but they were small, cramped, harder to navigate. That changed in the early 1970s, when diving teams began systematic documentation of all the wrecks. What they found inside I-169 was haunting not because of what was there, but because of how ordinary it all was. The submarine was on a routine patrol and resupply mission when it went down. Standard equipment, standard cargo, no exotic fuel, no experimental weapons, no secret technology. Just a working submarine doing what submarines did in 1944, operating in dangerous waters, hoping to avoid detection, hoping to make it back. The torpedo tubes were standard for the KD-6A class, some empty, some loaded with conventional torpedoes as you'd expect for a patrol vessel. The deck gun showed normal wear from use and saltwater exposure. Equipment throughout the boat matched what you'd find in any submarine of its class. Navigation instruments, communication gear, engine room machinery, crew quarters with personal effects. Throughout the flooded compartments, the remains of the crew, 70 men, distributed throughout the vessel in positions that tell the story of what happened in those final hours, not clustered randomly, but positioned where you'd expect to find submariners during an emergency, at engine controls near ventilation systems, at stations where they'd been trying desperately to restart systems that had failed. Personal effects throughout, photographs in waterproof cases, faces long faded, families back home, letters waiting to be sent, the small tokens sailors carried, good luck charms, family mementos, the everyday objects that connected them to lives beyond the steel hull. But no dramatic scenes, no sake bottles broken out for a final toast, no elaborate prayers scratched into bulkheads, just the quiet evidence of men doing their jobs until the air ran out. The wreck of I-169 sits among over 50 vessels, sunk during Operation Hailstone in February 1944, though it wasn't one of them. It arrived at Truk after the devastating raid, finding a base that was shattered, its defenses compromised, its infrastructure damaged. By April 1944, Truk was a shadow of its former strength. The Americans had moved on to other targets, but the threat of air raids remained. Japanese forces still at the base were on constant alert, submarines included. On April 4th, when air raid warnings sounded, I-169 executed a standard crash dive, the emergency procedure every submarine practiced, getting beneath the surface as quickly as possible to avoid detection and attack. You flood the ballast tanks, push the dive planes down, descend as fast as the boat will go. The dive itself was successful. The submarine reached depth, disappeared from surface view, avoided whatever threat had triggered the alert. But then came the problem. The engines wouldn't restart. To surface, a submarine needs its diesel engines to run compressors that blow the ballast tanks, pushing water out and replacing it with air. Without engines, you can't surface, and without surfacing, you can't ventilate. The air the crew breathes gets progressively more toxic as carbon dioxide builds up from respiration. Something failed in the ventilation system, possibly the snorkel mechanism that allowed the engines to draw air while submerged, possibly the engine intake valves, possibly a combination of factors. The exact mechanical failure doesn't matter as much as the consequence. The crew couldn't get the diesels running, and without the diesels, they were trapped. In a sealed submarine with 70 men breathing, you have hours at most before carbon dioxide levels become lethal. Not from oxygen depletion, there's still oxygen in the air, but from CO2 buildup. Your body can't process oxygen efficiently when CO2 concentrations rise. You get headaches, confusion, drowsiness. Eventually you lose consciousness. Then you die. The crew would have known what was happening. Submariners were trained for this scenario. They would have tried everything: manual ventilation, emergency procedures, attempts to restart the engines by any means available. The distribution of remains throughout the vessel suggests they were at their stations, working the problem until they physically couldn't anymore. No flooding, no fire, no enemy attack, just air that slowly turned poisonous while they fought to restart systems that wouldn't cooperate. The physical evidence throughout the wreck confirms this. No bomb craters, no torpedo damage, no blast holes or shrapnel scarring. The hull is intact, showing only the normal corrosion and deterioration you'd expect from 80 years underwater. The ballast tanks are configured as you'd expect for a submerged submarine, flooded, with the boat resting on the bottom after the crew died and the vessel slowly settled. No evidence of emergency blowing, no signs of catastrophic flooding from battle damage. Equipment is positioned normally, hatches sealed as they should be during dive operations. Control surfaces in standard positions. Everything points to a submarine that dived successfully and then simply couldn't come back up. This is how most submarine deaths actually happened in WWII, not from dramatic battles, but from mechanical failures, accidents, miscalculations. The submarines that died fighting at least had witnesses, action reports, stories that could be told. The ones that died quietly from equipment failure or navigational error or bad luck just disappeared, overdue, and presumed lost. I-169's crew had the misfortune of dying close enough to base that their wreck could eventually be found, but far enough into the war that their loss was just another entry in the casualty lists. One submarine, 70 men. Cause: diving accident during air raid alert. The Americans didn't even know they'd sunk it, because they hadn't. It sank itself. The wreck's condition tells us what the historical record confirms. This was an operational submarine lost to accident, not combat. The hull rests on an even keel on the sandy bottom at 100 to 130 feet, structurally intact, with the normal corrosion patterns you'd expect from decades of saltwater immersion, but no battle damage. No holes blown through the pressure hull. No torpedo strike craters. No bomb blast deformation. The steel shows the typical deterioration of a WWII-era submarine wreck. Rust, marine growth, weakening of structural members, but the kind of degradation that happens slowly over decades, not the catastrophic failure patterns you see in vessels that died violently. Inside, equipment remains largely in place. The control room shows instruments at their stations. The engine compartments contain machinery that failed mechanically, not from combat damage. No signs of fire, explosion, or flooding from external attack. The crew remains are distributed throughout the vessel in patterns consistent with men at duty stations during an emergency, near engine controls where they would have been trying to restart the diesels, at ventilation equipment where they would have been attempting to restore air circulation, in crew spaces where off-duty personnel would have been when the emergency began. This distribution tells the story of men working the problem, trying to save their boat and themselves, remaining at their stations as training dictated, even as the air slowly poisoned them. Archaeological surveys conducted over the decades, including detailed documentation in the 2010s and 2020s, confirm there are no exotic cargo holds, no modified compartments for intelligence equipment, no unusual stowage. The submarine carried standard provisions, standard armament, standard equipment for its class and mission profile. No aviation fuel drums that would have leaked petroleum sheens to the surface. No aircraft parts or experimental munitions. No reinforced bulkheads hiding secret equipment. Just a working patrol submarine equipped exactly as you'd expect. The personal effects scattered throughout the wreck are the standard items submariners carried. Photographs of families, letters written during quiet watches, small religious or cultural tokens. These items are present in many Truk wrecks. The intimate artifacts of men far from home, serving in dangerous conditions, holding on to connections to the lives they'd left behind. What's absent is equally telling. No evidence of looting or souvenir removal specific to this wreck, though some Truk sites were disturbed before heritage protections tightened. No mysteriously locked safes, no censored documents, or deliberately damaged logs. The wreck has been documented, surveyed, and protected as a war grave, but there's no conspiracy of silence, no hidden secrets too sensitive to reveal. The torpedo tubes contain what you'd expect, some empty, some with standard ordnance, configured normally for a patrol submarine. The deck gun shows typical wear and corrosion. The periscope housing is intact, in standard position, showing no unusual damage or modification. This is a submarine that looks like what it was, a routine patrol vessel that died from mechanical failure rather than enemy action, which in many ways makes it more tragic than the dramatic sinkings. There's no glory in suffocating because an engine won't start. No honor in dying from carbon dioxide poisoning during a routine dive. Just 70 men doing their jobs, following procedures, trying to save their boat, and running out of time. The Japanese Navy's records confirm this. I-169 was overdue on April 4, 1944. When it failed to report, it was listed as missing. The cause wasn't immediately known. Submarines went missing for many reasons, but there was no report of enemy engagement, no claims from U.S. forces of sinking a submarine on that date. It was only when the wreck was discovered decades later that the full story became clear. A diving accident, a ventilation failure, a crew that died at their stations trying to restart systems that wouldn't cooperate. 80 years later, I-169 remains a war grave, protected under Chukisi law and UNESCO Underwater Cultural Heritage Guidelines. The wreck is legally off-limits to artifact removal or disturbance beyond what's necessary for documentation and preservation. It's not just a wreck, it's a cemetery, 70 graves in a steel coffin. The remains of the crew, identifiable by uniform fragments and personal effects, are still entombed in the hull. Under both international law and Japanese cultural tradition, they rest where they die, the submarine itself serving as their memorial. Japanese veterans organizations and family members have made efforts over the years to honor those lost at Truk. Memorial services for all the Japanese personnel who died in the area include the crew of I-169, though this particular wreck receives less attention than the more dramatic Hailstone casualties. The site is part of Truk Lagoon's protected underwater museum, accessible to technical divers but regulated to prevent damage or theft. While some Truk wrecks suffered from looting in the decades before enforcement tightened, periscope lenses, brass fittings, even personal effects stolen by unscrupulous divers, I-169 has remained relatively undisturbed, its status as a war grave generally respected. Ecologically, the submarine has transformed over 8 decades. Like all the Truk wrecks, it's become an artificial reef, supporting marine life that has colonized every surface. Sponges grow in the openings and recesses. Corals, both hard and soft varieties, attach to the steel, building layers of living tissue over the dead metal. Anemones wave their tentacles in the current. Fish of dozens of species use the wreck as shelter and hunting ground. Groupers in the larger spaces. Smaller reef fish darting through the coral growth. Predators like jacks and barracuda patrolling the perimeter. Marine biologists have documented the transformation of Truk's wrecks into thriving ecosystems, though specific species counts vary by site and survey. These artificial reefs now support more biomass than the surrounding natural bottom in many cases. The complex structure of the wrecks, providing habitat that wouldn't otherwise exist. Researchers studying climate change impacts and ocean acidification use sites like this as reference points, structures of known age that can be monitored over time to track how marine ecosystems respond to changing conditions. The steel corrodes slowly, but the question remains whether the reef ecosystems will adapt as conditions shift, and eventually as the structures themselves fail. For historians, I-169 represents something important, a reminder that most military deaths in WWII weren't dramatic or heroic. They were mundane, mechanical, accidental. For every ship that went down fighting, shooting back, engaging the enemy, there were others that just failed. Equipment broke, navigation errors put vessels on reefs, weather overwhelmed ships that would have survived in calmer conditions, and submarines, those most fragile of warships, died from 100 small failures that added up to catastrophe. I-169's crew didn't die fighting. They died trying to restart an engine during a routine dive. They died doing exactly what they were trained to do, following procedures, working the problem, staying at their stations. And they died anyway, because sometimes training and discipline and courage aren't enough when the machinery fails and the air runs out. The historical record is clear on what happened. No mysteries, no conspiracies, no secrets buried with the wreck. Just a submarine on patrol, an air raid alert, a dive that went wrong, and 70 men who never made it home. The Japanese Navy recorded the loss. The Americans never knew they'd been credited with a kill they didn't make. And the submarine sat on the bottom of Truk Lagoon for 30 years before anyone found it and pieced together what had happened. Today, the wreck serves multiple purposes. A war grave to be respected, a historical site to be documented, an artificial reef supporting marine life, and a reminder of how men actually died in this war. Not always gloriously, not always fighting, sometimes just suffocating in the dark because an engine wouldn't start. There's no locked safe with secrets, no censored documents, no exotic cargo or covert missions. Just a submarine that dived and couldn't surface, and 70 men who died as the carbon dioxide built up around them, trying until the last moments to save themselves. That's the truth the wreck tells. Not dramatic, but real. The conning tower still rises from the sand at 110 feet, coral spreading across steel that hasn't seen sunlight since April 4th, 1944, hatches sealed from dive operations, and in the flooded compartments, 70 men who died not from enemy action, but from mechanical failure and bad luck. This is I-169, not a mystery, not a conspiracy, just a tragedy. A submarine that dove to escape danger and never came back up. A crew that did everything right and died anyway. That's the story. That's what the evidence shows. That's what happened. Sometimes history doesn't need embellishment. Sometimes the truth, quiet, undramatic, mechanical, is enough. 80 years on, the ocean keeps the wreck. The coral keeps growing. And 70 men rest where they died, not in battle, but in the dark, waiting for engines that never restarted and air that never came. That's I-169. That's the real story.